You look at these photos and see an angel, a naive girl with golden curls, dubbed America's sweetheart by the world. But what if I told you that behind this innocent face lurked Hollywood's most ruthless mobster? Mary Pickford didn't just play orphans, she built a corporate empire on them. This fragile woman coldly crushed her husband's ego and career, drove her own brother and sister to the grave with her toxic overprotection, and instead of dismantling Hollywood's system of servitude, she cynically took the helm. When her beauty began to fade, she entombed herself alive in a sprawling mansion, slowly losing her mind with a bottle of whiskey for company. Today, we'll rip the mask off the 20th century's main angel and reveal the face of a true monster. You look at these old black and white photos and see an angel. Golden curls, big sad eyes, hands folded in prayer. America's sweetheart. A girl you wanted to save, protect, and adopt. That's exactly what she aimed for. Because while the world cooed over little Mary, the real woman behind the scenes, Gladys Smith, known to us as Mary Pickford, methodically, cynically, and ruthlessly brought the toughest industry on earth to its knees. Forget everything you've heard about the naive stars of silent cinema. The truth is, Mary Pickford was the first godfather in a skirt in film history. She was a tyrant who built a gilded cage for all of Hollywood, but forgot to leave herself a way out. You probably clicked on this expecting a biography of an actress, but you're in for something entirely different. We're dissecting the anatomy of power. Right now, 3 questions are spinning in your head. First, how did this fragile girl intimidate the toughest businessmen of the early 20th century and make them pay her millions, a sum that seems fantastical today? Second, was her legendary romance with Douglas Fairbanks a real fairy tale? Or was it the most successful PR project in history before the Kardashians? And third, why did a woman who had the world at her feet end her days in complete isolation, conversing only with a bottle of whiskey and ghosts of the past? By the end of this story, your view of Hollywood's golden age will change forever. We won't retell gossip from the 20s newspapers. We'll look at contracts, ultimatums, and personal tragedies that Mary carefully hid behind the mask of an eternal girl. I've spent countless hours studying memoirs of contemporaries and financial reports of that era to show you what's hidden beneath the gloss. You'll see the story of a brilliant monster who sacrificed her soul for eternal youth and learn the terrible price she paid for it. Get ready. Reality will be harsher than any of her films. Act 1, A Wolf in Lace. To grasp the phenomenon of Mary Pickford, toss out the image of a curly-haired girl frolicking on lawns. Picture instead a Wall Street wolf draped in silk and lace. Behind Hollywood's closed doors, when the cameras stopped rolling, she wasn't America's sweetheart. She was the Bank of America. And that nickname wasn't a joke. Why does this matter? Because in the 1910s, women in business weren't just voiceless. They were set pieces. Actresses were disposable, dolls owned by powerful studio bosses. Mary Pickford didn't just break this rule. She torched it and sold the ashes to studios for $1 million. Imagine the scene. Adolph Zukor's office, the head of Paramount Pictures, a man who could end careers with a single call. Across from him sits a petite girl, barely 5 feet tall. She looks like she should be in school. But the conversation isn't about art. It's about Zukor's survival. Mary knew the industry's biggest secret, one the bosses tried to bury. People didn't go to the movies for the studio logo. They went for her. She was the first to understand the power of a personal brand, and she decided to cash in on every curl on her head. Pickford's negotiation tactics were legendary, always following the same script. She'd walk into the office with her mother, Charlotte, another shadowy figure in this tale, and just stay silent. She let the bosses offer sums that would make anyone's head spin, and she'd shake her head sadly, as if the money insulted her. In 1916, she pulled off what film historians call the Great Heist. She made Zukor sign a contract with terms that seem insane even today, a century later. Here's the kicker. Mary demanded and got $10,000 a week. A week, while the average American worker earned about $700 to $800 a year. But the salary was just the tip of the iceberg. Mary understood. A salary is a leash. She needed power. So the contract included a clause that flipped the industry on its head. She got 50% of the profits from all her films. Moreover, she created her own production company within the studio. She had veto power over directors, scripts, even supporting actors. Zukor was essentially funding her dictatorship with his own money. When reporters asked if she was asking for too much, Mary, adjusting her famous curls, delivered a line that should be in economics textbooks. "I can't afford to work for peanuts. I need to feed my family, and I have to do it while my face sells. Time is my enemy." It was the cold, cynical calculation of a woman who knew the public would love another as soon as Mary showed her first wrinkle. But the real shock came in 1919. That was when Mary moved from blackmail to a coup. Studio bosses, tired of the star's growing demands, decided to band together and cap salaries. They thought forming a cartel would rein in Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, and Douglas Fairbanks. They cornered a rat. But they forgot this rat could build her own ships. In response to the threat of pay cuts, Mary made a bold move. She, Chaplin, Fairbanks, and director Griffith announced the creation of their own studio, United Artists. It was unheard of. Actors becoming owners of the means of production. Metro Pictures head Richard Rowland sarcastically quipped, "The lunatics have taken over the asylum." But lunatic Mary was the sanest person in the room. United Artists was built on the principle of complete creative and financial independence. Now Mary didn't have to fight for a cut of the profits. She took all the profits. She became the distributor of her own films. She cut out the middlemen. At that moment, Mary Pickford stopped being just an actress. She became a mogul. She personally checked the books down to the last cent. There are stories of her firing janitors for using too much soap at the studio, while her films raked in millions. The contrast between her image as a generous, kind orphan on screen and a stingy, tough businesswoman in the office was stark. She built an empire out of the fear of poverty that haunted her since childhood. Every dollar was a brick in the wall she erected between herself and the world. But the irony was, the more power she gained, the less human she became. She learned to control money, contracts, and men in suits. Act 2, a toxic fairy tale. But there was one man she couldn't just buy or fire. Or so she thought. Their union was supposed to be the greatest love story, but for Mary, it was just another merger. And it was here, at the peak of her financial success, that her most terrifying personal disaster began. If you've ever seen photos of Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks, you know what the American dream looks like. They were Hollywood's first royal couple, the prototype for all future Brangelinas. He was the king of action, a muscular, ever-smiling hero leaping from balconies. She was the delicate princess with golden curls. Their home, the legendary estate Pickfair, was dubbed the Second White House. Kings, presidents, and even Einstein dreamed of visiting. The world saw their union as the perfect romantic fairy tale. But behind the high gates of Pickfair, a psychological thriller unfolded, where a predator slowly devoured its prey. And the predator in this pair wasn't the muscular hero. The predator was the delicate Mary. Why does this matter? Because their marriage wasn't just a union of two hearts. It was a merger of two mega-corporations. And like any merger, only one CEO could remain. Mary Pickford loved Douglas, no doubt about it. But her love was suffocating, possessive, and ultimately maternal. Douglas was a big child, energetic, slightly immature, dependent on public adoration. Mary was the adult. She took on the role of warden, accountant, and manager of his life. At first, it worked. Mary structured Douglas's chaos, but over time, her care turned into tyranny. Pickfair operated under strict rules set by Mary. Dinners were scheduled, protocols were rigid, guest lists were approved. Douglas, who was used to being the life of the party, found himself in a gilded cage where even his jokes needed his wife's approval. The turning point came in the late 20s when the threat of sound loomed over silent films. For actors of that era, it was akin to an apocalypse. Douglas panicked. His acting style, grand gestures, acrobatics, silent expression, didn't mesh well with a microphone. He needed support. He needed his wife to say, "We'll get through this." Instead, Mary saw his weakness as a threat to the brand. The most telling act of this public destruction was their only joint film, The Taming of the Shrew in 1929. The title sounded like cruel irony. On screen, Douglas's character tamed Mary's. In reality, on set, Mary methodically destroyed her husband's self-esteem. Witnesses described the atmosphere as an icy hell. Mary, whose diction was flawless, openly criticized Douglas's voice, his intonation, his demeanor. She halted filming to correct him, like a strict teacher correcting a lazy student. For a proud man used to being an idol to millions, it wasn't just humiliation, it was castration. She demanded perfection because a failed film meant financial loss. Her husband's emotional state was last on her list. The film was released, but the chemistry between them was dead. Audiences felt the tension. Mary won the argument, but lost her husband. Douglas sought solace where many broken men do, in affairs and fading dreams. But even here, Mary's reaction wasn't that of a heartbroken wife, but an enraged boss whose employee violated corporate ethics. When news broke of Douglas's affair with British socialite Sylvia Ashley, Mary didn't throw a dish-breaking tantrum. She went into Cold War mode. She used the press, public opinion, and her lawyers to make Douglas's life hell. She painted him as the traitor of the fairy tale, the destroyer of the American dream. Douglas begged for reconciliation. He got on his knees. He wrote letters. But Mary Pickford didn't forgive weakness. To her, his infidelity wasn't just a blow to the heart. It was a blow to her control. And losing control was something she couldn't allow. Their divorce in 1936 was the final act. Mary kept Pickfair, a symbol of their power. Douglas was left with nothing but fading fame. The most tragic part of this story is Douglas's end. Stripped of support, exiled from his own paradise, he burned out in a few years. He died in 1939 of a heart attack in his sleep, at just 56. They say he looked 70 before he passed. Mary outlived him by 40 years. When she was told of Douglas's death, she didn't break down. Witnesses say she froze, and something like realization flickered in her eyes. She had destroyed the one person who loved her not as Mary Pickford, the star, but as a woman. She won the battle for power in marriage, but the price of victory was absolute loneliness. Many biographers try to justify Mary, claiming she was a victim of circumstances and male infidelity. But the facts speak otherwise. She systematically crushed Douglas with her intellect and will until nothing remained of the joyful Robin Hood but a shadow. It was cannibalism at its finest. She consumed his energy to fuel her greatness, then discarded the empty shell. Act 3. The Original Wound. Gladys Smith's hungry childhood. To grasp why this petite woman had such a monstrous need for control and domination, we need to rewind the film. Back to the very start. To where a star wasn't born, but a frightened girl who swore she'd never be weak again. Monsters aren't born, they're made. Psychologists say, we all come from childhood. In Mary Pickford's case, it should be. She came from a hell disguised as childhood. So far, we've painted Mary Pickford as a ruthless mogul and domineering wife. But where did this iron grip come from in a creature that looked like a porcelain doll? The answer lies in a name she hated and tried to erase from memory. She wasn't Mary. She was Gladys Louise Smith. And Gladys Smith didn't live in a lavish mansion. She lived in a constant, sticky, paralyzing fear of starving to death. This is a critical point. Without understanding Gladys, you can't understand Mary. It all began in Toronto in 1898. Gladys was just 5 when her father, a laborer named John Charles Smith, died in a work accident, leaving his wife Charlotte with 3 small children and not a penny to her name. At that moment, Gladys's childhood ended. There was no gradual growing up, just a brutal slap of reality. One evening, shortly after the funeral, Charlotte sat the children down and uttered a phrase that became the foundation of Mary Pickford's psyche. She said they had so little money that they might have to send the younger children, Lottie and Jack, to an orphanage, and Gladys to relatives. The family would have to break apart to survive. To a 5-year-old girl, it sounded like a death sentence. In her young mind, a clear, unbreakable logic formed. No money meant the death of the family. And Gladys made a decision. She stood up and told her mother it wouldn't happen. She would go to work. Think about that. 5 years old. At that age, kids learn to tie their shoelaces. Gladys learned to sell herself. The Smith family hit the vaudeville stage not for fame. It was a matter of survival. The next 10 years of the future Queen of Hollywood were like a Dickensian labor camp. Endless tours through grimy American towns, sleeping in train stations, eating once a day. Gladys became the family's main breadwinner. She, not her mother, negotiated with theater managers for an extra $1. She stole coal to warm their room in a cheap hotel. That's when the terrifying transformation occurred. Gladys Smith killed the child within her to become a little soldier. She swapped roles with her mother. Charlotte, a weak and frightened widow, became the daughter, and little Gladys became the father of the family. She took on the responsibility for 3 lives. This burden would crush a grown man. But Gladys didn't break. She hardened. She realized the world was a dangerous place where everyone tried to deceive you, and the only way to protect yourself was to control everything. absolutely everything. When in 1907 she approached the great impresario David Belasco on Broadway, she was no longer a girl. She was a veteran of the survival war in a teenager's body. She didn't ask for a role. She demanded an audience. And when Belasco asked why she was so eager to be on stage, she didn't speak of a love for art. She said she needed to feed her family. Belasco gave her a role but set a condition. The name Gladys Smith was too plain. She needed a new name. Thus, Mary Pickford was born. But here's the tragedy. Gladys Smith never disappeared. She remained deep inside Mary, curled up in fear. Even when Mary Pickford became the richest woman in showbiz, even when she slept on silk sheets at Pickfair, the Gladys inside her still feared creditors would come tomorrow and take Lottie and Jack to an orphanage. This pathological fear of poverty explains her insane greed, why she demanded every cent from studios, why she counted tickets. Not for luxury. For her, money was a wall between her and that cold night in Toronto. There was never enough money because the fear was bottomless. She built an empire to protect her family. But, as often happens with traumatized people, the tool of protection turned into a weapon of destruction. Wanting to shield her brother and sister from the cruel world, she deprived them of independence, turning them into perpetual dependence. She was so afraid they'd fall, she never let them walk. Gladys Smith would have starved without Mary Pickford, but Mary Pickford became a monster because Gladys Smith never let her relax. Act 4. Dictatorship on set, the lab of deception. Now that we understand the roots of her obsession with control, we see how this trauma bled into her professional life. Mary Pickford didn't just act in films. She seized the set, becoming a shadow dictator feared by even the most seasoned directors. If you were magically transported to a Mary Pickford film set in 1920, the first thing you'd notice is the bizarre hierarchy. You'd see a director in a chair labeled director. You'd see cameramen, lighting techs, and writers. But after 5 minutes, you'd realize these grown men with experience and ambition weren't looking at the script or each other. They were watching a tiny woman in a patched orphan costume with fear and hope. Official film history says the director is the god on set. In Mary Pickford's world, the director was just a middle manager, there to stay out of her way. This shatters another great myth, that Mary was just a talented actress, clay in the hands of masters. The reality was shocking. She was the sculptor, and directors were her tools. Why did this happen? Because Mary Pickford understood what no one else did. She wasn't selling stories, she was selling the Mary brand. No one knew this brand better than she did. Scripts rewrote themselves on the fly if Mary felt a line didn't meet her audience's expectations. If a director insisted on a vision that clashed with her commercial instincts, he was out the door before he could shout, "Cut!" But the true genius of her tyranny lay not in managing people, but in mastering physics and light. By the mid-20s, Mary faced a problem that could destroy her empire overnight. She was over 30, a grown, divorced, and remarried woman who smoked and drank whiskey. But on screen, she had to play 12-year-old girls. Any wrinkle, any shadow of fatigue on her face could shatter the illusion worth millions. The audience wouldn't forgive her for growing up. So Mary turned the set into a high-tech lab of deception. With her personal cameraman Charles Rocher, another man whose career hung on her whims, she developed a revolutionary lighting system. This wasn't creativity, it was engineering. They spent hours arranging lights to literally erase time from her face. Mary knew lenses better than most Hollywood cameramen. She knew the angle that made her look 11 and the one that made her look 35. She controlled every frame. Watch her films from that era and notice. Mary is almost always surrounded by oversized props, huge furniture, tall door handles, specially hired tall supporting actors, all part of a grand manipulation of proportions to make her appear tiny, a fragile girl. This was a dictatorship of perfectionism. There's a story of Mary forcing a scene to be reshot dozens of times, not because she performed poorly, but because the light made her chin look too strong. "An orphan can't look like she could buy this bank," she'd say. The irony that grinds your teeth. On set, she was exactly the person who could buy a bank, yet she spent all her energy looking like a helpless victim. Directors who worked with her often left the set gray-haired. Ernst Lubitsch, the great German director Mary brought from Europe as another pricey toy for her studio, was shocked. He was used to being the Kaiser on set. In Hollywood, he found the Kaiser wore skirts and bows. Their collaboration on Rosita became a battle of titans, with Lubitsch trying to create art and Pickford pushing business. In the end, she called the film the worst of her career and tried to destroy the negatives. Why? Because Lubitsch made her play an adult woman, and audiences didn't accept it. Mary was right in her fears, and this lesson made her even less tolerant of other opinions. She fired people for trying to bring realism into her films. She didn't need realism. She needed an idealized, sterile picture that worked like a drug for the post-war audience. Essentially, Mary Pickford became the first showrunner in history. She was in charge of the final cut long before the term became a director's holy grail. She spent nights in the editing room, personally splicing film. She cut scenes where other actors performed too well and could overshadow her. It was ruthless Darwinism. Only one alpha predator survived the film, Little Mary. But this total control over production had a downside. By micromanaging every aspect, she trapped herself in a creative dead end. She surrounded herself with yes men who feared telling her the truth. Times were changing. The jazz age demanded new heroines, bold, sexy, dangerous like Clara Bow or Louise Brooks. Yet Mary continued with manic persistence to polish the image of a Victorian doll, using her power to stop time. On set, she was a god. But outside the studio walls, the world changed faster than she could rearrange her sets. And this gap between her illusory world, ruled with an iron fist, and the reality she couldn't control, grew ever more perilous. Act 5. Family as Dependents. The slow demise of brother and sister. If she was ruthless with her employees, with her family, Mary Pickford did something far more sinister. She turned them into her entourage, stripping them of their own destinies. In any classic fairy tale, there's an evil stepmother or jealous sisters. In Mary Pickford's tale, it was the opposite. She was the fairy godmother showering her kin with gold. But no one warned them this gold was radioactive. The Pickford family story is perhaps the clearest example of how overprotection and financial dominance can decay personalities faster than drugs. Mary had a brother, Jack, and a sister, Lottie. Both were talented, both were beautiful, and both were doomed the moment their elder sister became America's sweetheart. The official story was that the Pickfords were a clan, the Four Musketeers, standing strong with their mother, Charlotte. The reality was far more cynical. Mary was the CEO of the family corporation, with Jack and Lottie as her eternal, incompetent subordinates, unfireable, yet endlessly humiliated by her perfection. Let's look at Jack Pickford, The younger brother, the favorite, the golden boy. Critics of the time whispered that as an actor, Jack might have been even more talented than Mary. He had a natural charisma Mary achieved through hard work. But Jack lacked what made Mary a star: hunger. Why fight? Why learn a role? Why show up on time? Mary was always there with her checkbook. She handled his police troubles, paid off his gambling debts, and negotiated roles for him thrown in with her contracts. She created a consequence-free world for him. Mary loved Jack madly, but it was the love of a constrictor. She wouldn't let him fall, but she wouldn't let him stand either. Jack understood his role. He was the court jester to the queen. This awareness of his own worthlessness drove him into the abyss. Substance, indulgence, endless parties. It wasn't just hedonism. It was his only rebellion against his sister's sanctity. The most terrifying moment of truth for this family business came in 1920, when Jack's wife, the beautiful actress Olive Thomas, died in Paris, drinking poison intended for Jack's syphilis treatment, either by accident or design. It was a colossal scandal, the first of its kind in Hollywood. The press was ready to tear the Pickfords apart. What did Mary do? She didn't just console her brother. She went into crisis management mode. She used all her connections, all her influence, to bury the story, rewrite obituaries, and save the brand's reputation. To her, her brother's tragedy was a logistical problem to solve, to keep ticket sales from dropping. Jack was saved from prison and disgrace, but he was broken as a person. He realized he lived only because he was Mary Pickford's brother. With Lottie Pickford, the situation was even more dramatic. Lottie was the dark version of Mary. If Mary played innocence, Lottie lived sin. She was more beautiful, more sensual, and far more modern than her sister. But Mary, consciously or not, stifled her sister's career. There was a cruel joke in Hollywood. There's only one Mary Pickford, and she won't tolerate competition, even if the competitor shares her last name. Lottie got roles, but always remained in the shadows. Mary was the sun, and Lottie was the scorched earth around it. Lottie tried to get attention the only way that angered saints. She threw the wildest parties in Hollywood, married countless times, and drank with the best of them. It was a cry for help. Look at me. I'm alive. I'm not your shadow. But Mary looked at her sister with cold judgment, pursed lips, and wrote another check. Mary turned her loved ones into dependents. She housed them close, controlled their spending. She bought their lives wholesale, and the most tragic part was she genuinely believed she was saving them. The ghost of Gladys Smith inside her whispered, "You must feed everyone or we'll perish." She fed their bodies with delicacies but starved their souls, depriving them of the right to err and take responsibility. The outcome of this overprotection is terrifying in its statistics. Jack Pickford died at 36. His body, worn out by indulgence and disease, simply gave up. Lottie Pickford died at 43 from a heart attack brought on by years of self-destruction. Mary outlived them all. She was left alone in her vast estate. Those for whom she built this empire burned in her fire. She defeated poverty. She shielded her family from the outside world, but she couldn't protect them from herself. The death of her brother and sister marked the beginning of her end. Without dependence, her role as mother protector lost its meaning. She had no one left to save, no one to control. And then her controlling gaze, once fixed on family and studios, turned on her only remaining enemy, herself and her reflection in the mirror. Act 6. The execution of curls, downfall, and seclusion in a mausoleum. Before Mary Pickford vanished into darkness, she made her most public and fatal mistake. She thought she could defeat time by destroying the symbol that made her a goddess. On 28. The world was losing its mind to jazz. Women were shortening their skirts, smoking with cigarette holders, and dancing the Charleston. The Victorian era was dead. Yet in the middle of this roaring ocean stood a solitary island, Mary Pickford. She still wore her famous golden curls. She still played innocent girls, though she was 36. A marketing genius, Mary smelled the smoke. Her brand, which had raked in millions for 15 years, was about to turn into a pumpkin. The audience no longer wanted orphans. They wanted flappers, bold, modern, sexually liberated women, and a new, terrifying enemy loomed on the horizon: sound. The silent film era was ending. Actors had to speak. Mary Pickford, always ahead of the curve, made a decision she thought was the only smart business move. She decided on a radical rebranding. She chose to kill Little Mary to give birth to grown-up Mary. On June 21, 1928, an event in New York made headlines worldwide, overshadowing political news. Mary Pickford went to the hairdresser. This wasn't just a haircut. It was a public execution. Mary invited journalists. She wanted the world to witness her transformation. But when Charles Bach's scissors closed on the first golden curl, the room fell silent as a grave. Witnesses said it felt like a medical amputation, not a salon visit. Curls that symbolized purity and hope for a generation of Americans fell to the dirty floor. She kept 6 curls. 2 are now in a Los Angeles museum, and when you see them, you don't see hair, you see relics. Mary expected the world to admire her bravery and modernity. She awaited headlines. Pickford finally becomes a modern woman. Reality slapped her hard. The public's reaction was not just cold, it was hysterical. Thousands of letters flooded Pickfair, but they weren't congratulations. They were curses. People wrote, "You killed my Mary. You betrayed us. Now you're just like everyone else." Fans felt deceived. They didn't buy tickets for films about an ordinary woman with a bob. They paid for a fairy tale, an illusion of eternal childhood. By cutting her hair, Mary shattered the magic. She became mortal. But Mary didn't give up. She was a fighter. She threw everything into her first talkie, Coquette. It was her all-in bet. In this film, she played a socialite, flirted, wore a bob, and horror of horrors, spoke. When the film released in 1929, theaters were packed. Everyone wanted to hear the legend's voice. And here emerged another inconvenient truth. Mary's voice was normal. She had good diction, a pleasant tone, but it didn't fit the image. When the angel spoke, the magic vanished. Yes, Mary Pickford won an Oscar for her role in Coquette. It was the second Academy Awards ceremony, but film historians still debate this award. Many believe it was a Lifetime Achievement Oscar, a consolation prize, or a bribe, considering Mary was one of the Academy's founders. It was a victory on paper, but a defeat in the audience's hearts. The film broke even, but her subsequent films flopped. The audience voted with their dollars. They didn't want to see Mary Pickford as an adult, sipping cocktails and dealing with marital issues, but they also couldn't watch a 40-year-old woman play a child. The camera and sound were too unforgiving of age. Mary found herself in a trap she hadn't foreseen. She was a prisoner of her own perfection. She had created such a powerful monolithic image that any attempt to break free was seen as heresy. Charlie Chaplin, her partner at United Artists, was craftier. He delayed the transition to sound as long as possible, keeping his tramp silent for almost another decade. Mary rushed, and that haste cost her career. In 1933, after the failure of Secrets, Mary Pickford did what she did best, made a tough, cold decision. She watched the rough cut, saw a tired woman trying to play passion, and said, "Enough." She left the movies. For good. She was 41. Most stars fade slowly. They transition to mother roles, then grandmothers, appear in cheap TV shows, clinging to the remnants of fame. Mary Pickford chose a political death. She cut off her career as sharply as those curls. She said, "I want to be remembered young." It was an act of incredible pride and willpower. She refused to age in front of the public. She locked her image in the vault of history, while she remained outside. But leaving the movies created a vacuum. Her whole life, since age 5, she worked. Work was her drug, her shield, her way of control. Now she had millions, a huge house, power in United Artists, but no purpose. She had nowhere to go in the morning. No one to play. And then Mary Pickford began her longest and saddest role, the ghost of Pickfair. She decided that if the world couldn't see her young, the world wouldn't see her at all. Imagine a house built for parties. 42 rooms, 187 doors, a huge pool, halls where Charlie Chaplin, Albert Einstein, and the Prince of Wales danced. Pickfair was a symbol of life, success, and eternal celebration. But by the mid-1950s, this house became the world's most expensive mausoleum. Windows were covered with heavy curtains, blocking out the California sun. Phones rang, but only servants answered. The lady of the house was there, but to the outside world, she ceased to exist. Mary Pickford's last decades are a ready-made horror movie script in the style of Sunset Boulevard. But reality was scarier than film because there was no director to yell, "Cut!" Why did she do it? Why did a woman with a steel will lock herself in 4 walls? The answer is simple and terrifying. She couldn't forgive herself for aging. For Mary Pickford, aging wasn't a biological process, but a personal insult and professional failure. She built an empire on a girl's face. When the face changed, she decided the contract with the world was void. She preferred to be remembered from old films rather than seen as an old woman. Her world shrank to the size of a bedroom. At the center of this universe stood a massive bed, piled with business papers, books, and most importantly, bottles. The Smith family curse, the descent into darkness, finally caught up with her. She fought it all her life, despising her father, brother, and sister for their weakness. But in the vacuum, without work, without the adrenaline of filming, she found solace in the same thing they did. Whiskey became her new partner. Gin was her lover. Servants told how the great Mary Pickford could stay in her bedroom for days, communicating with the world only by phone. But, and this is crucial to understanding her character, even in deep despair, she remained a tyrant. She wasn't a senile old woman. Lying in bed with a glass, she continued to run United Artists' affairs. She sold shares, negotiated the sale of her film library, fired people. The phone became her scepter. The voice on the line might be drunk, but the grip remained iron. She terrorized her third husband, Charles "Buddy" Rogers, turning the once handsome actor and jazz man into her caretaker and errand boy. They say in moments of confusion, she called him Douglas. The creepiest ritual in the house was the nightly movie screenings. Mary would descend to the home theater to watch her old films. Imagine this scene. An elderly, tired woman with trembling hands sits in the dark, watching a screen where a 20-year-old radiant girl with golden curls conquers the world. She was in love with her ghost. She was jealous of her past self. She cried watching Douglas Fairbanks on screen, the man she destroyed and lost. She created a cult of self-worship. She banned publishing her late photos. If any visitor, who were fewer and fewer, accidentally saw her without makeup, it was akin to treason. She wanted to stop time, and the only way to do that was to freeze the space around her. In 1976, the Academy decided to award her an honorary Oscar for her contribution to cinema. It was supposed to be a triumphant return, but what viewers saw shocked the nation. Mary refused to attend the ceremony. The crew came to Pickford. It looked like a report from a bunker. Mary sat in a chair, dressed in a luxurious gown, but her gaze was empty and frightened. She looked like a wax figure of herself. When handed the statuette, she whispered a brief, "Thank you." Millions of TV viewers were shocked. They expected to see a legend. They saw a deeply unhappy, lonely person dragged into the light against her will. It was the last time the world saw Mary Pickford. She died 3 years later, in 1979, from a stroke. At the end of her life, she said a phrase that sums up her entire struggle. "I wish I could be that girl again, who feared nothing but poverty. Now I'm rich, but I fear everything, especially the light." She died in the house built with money from her innocence, surrounded by luxury, but in absolute emotional poverty. She outlived everyone: husbands, lovers, enemies, friends, brother, sister. She won the survival race. But at the finish line, there was no one to congratulate her. Act 7. The Golden Prison of Mary Pickford. Reality cruelly outstripped expectations. The girl who dreamed of safety and control got them in full. But the price was steep. She entombed herself alive in a golden sarcophagus of her own making. Now that we've journeyed from the slums of Toronto to a dark bedroom in Beverly Hills, there's one last step to take. We need to understand what this woman truly left behind. Not films, not a studio, but a lesson Hollywood learned by heart, yet fears to speak aloud. There's a pretty myth they love to tell in film schools. Mary Pickford created United Artists to free actors from studio slavery. That's a lie. Mary Pickford created United Artists to free herself. For everyone else, she tightened the noose with her own hands. Let's face it. The Hollywood system Mary helped cement built on the infamous 7-year contract. It was legalized slavery. The studio owned your name, your face, your voice, even your moral image. They could rent you out, force you into an abortion, forbid you to marry. If you refused a role, your contract froze. You couldn't just wait it out. You were chained. What did Mary Pickford do with her power? Did she dismantle this system? No, she let it. The tragedy and hypocrisy of her legacy lie in the fact that Mary Pickford made a Shawshank escape. But once free, she didn't blow up the wall. She patched the hole she crawled through and sat in the warden's chair. As a producer and studio head, she used the same oppressive methods she once fought against. She hired actors under crushing terms. She demanded absolute obedience. She grasped the grim truth of capitalism. To stay free, you must own others. Her success became a curse for future generations of actors. Studio bosses, Mayer, Zukor, the Warners, looked at Pickford and got scared. They saw what could happen if they gave the cattle, as they called actors, too much freedom. In response to Pickford's success, the system didn't soften, it hardened. The screws tightened to the limit so no girl with curls could dictate terms again. Mary Pickford showed that the American dream in Hollywood works like a henhouse. Peck the nearest, defecate on the lower, and climb to the top. She set a precedent not for creative freedom, but for elite impunity. She proved that rules are unwritten only for those with a controlling stake. For 99% of the industry, she became not a liberator, but an unreachable exception that confirmed the rule of slavery. Her real legacy is cynicism. She taught the industry that talent is just a lever for gaining power. And once you get that power, you must immediately forget solidarity and start building your own fence. She died the richest woman in film, while dozens of brilliant actors of her era faded away in poverty, crushed by the system United Artists was part of. Mary Pickford wasn't a revolutionary. She was a successful mutant of the system, one who grew bigger than the system itself and devoured its resources. Mary Pickford, the girl who feared poverty, became a woman who sold illusions, a tyrant with an angel's face, a victim turned predator. She won at capitalism but lost at humanity. She built a golden cage for Douglas Fairbanks, for her family, and ultimately for herself. Mary Pickford's story is a brutal lesson on what happens when the fear of losing control becomes the sole driving force of life. You gain the whole world, but end up in an empty room with drawn curtains, alone with a bottle and the ghosts of those you used as steps to your throne. The reality is this: there are no heroes in this story, only survivors. But Mary was just one side of the coin. There was a man who saw all this filth, all this hypocrisy of the 7-year slavery, and chose not to lead the system, but to mock it. A man Mary Pickford both hated for his unruliness and idolized for his genius. While Mary built a business empire, Charlie Chaplin built an ideological bomb. You think Chaplin was just a funny tramp? The Federal Bureau of Investigation didn't think so. They had a 2,000-page file on him. If Mary was Hollywood's Stalin, then Chaplin was its Trotsky. His story isn't about money. It's about sex, political persecution, and exile from the country he made laugh. How did a man who made the whole world laugh become public enemy number one? And why couldn't Mary Pickford save him? Or didn't she want to? Subscribe to the channel to catch this story and discover the dark side of Charlie Chaplin. Where Mary's business ends, Charlie's madness begins.